My name is Naomi McLeod, and I am the Program Director at the American Parkinson's Association with the Virginia chapter. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am pleased to welcome you to our webinar series, our program designed for people with Parkinson's disease, as well as their care partners, family members, and healthcare providers. We're very grateful to have Tish Havel, the CEO and founder of the Brain Donor Project, here with us this afternoon. After a brief introduction, we will turn the presentation over to her. I do want to note that at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A button. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A chat. And following her presentation, we will have some time to go over any questions. So, to introduce our speaker for today, Tish Havel is the founder and CEO of the Brain Donor Project, a unique nonprofit that exclusively supports the brain banks of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, the NeuroBioBank. The Brain Donor Project was established in the late 2016 to raise awareness of the critical need for donated brain tissue to advance the science of brain disease and to simplify the process of becoming a brain donor. To date, nearly 23,000 people have taken the steps to become a brain donor when the time comes. The Brain Donor Project was inspired by the death of Tish's dad, who died from Lewy body dementia and was a brain donor himself. Please welcome Tish today for her presentation.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me today. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, I know how to do this.
Go to slideshow.
Thank you.
And then from the start.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, for taking a few minutes. I really appreciate you bothering to learn about this because it's very important. The biggest problem right now with brain donation is that not enough people know about it. I really believe if we could get the word out enough, that would change, because once they do, any objections that most people have just kind of seem to fall away. So that's part of the problem, is the lack of awareness, or they have misconceptions about brain donation. And the biggest one that we seem to face all the time is that most people think it's part of organ donation, and it is not. You have to make separate arrangements because they don't take the brain. I don't know if that's ever going to work out, because they're never going to be able to transplant them. So also, body donation is not the same as brain donation. Anatomical body donation programs do not use the brain tissue for neuroscience research, which is how we learn how it works. So that's not quite the same thing. It is possible to do both, though, and I can talk about that later. A lot of people think maybe only people who have a disorder that their brains are needed, and that is totally not the case. So I love to tell people who are in certain patient advocacy organizations that, because you can talk to your family and your friends about this, it's a great way for them to support the science of brain disease. Also, it's not disfiguring. An open casket is still very much an option if that's something that you'd like to do. And there are no additional costs to the family when donating a brain through the Brain Donor Project to the NIH. The NIH understands how important this tissue is to advance science, though, so they reimburse everybody along the way. Let's see. As Naomi said, we learned the hard way. Sorry, I love looking at this picture. This is my dad. He died, as she said, of Lewy body's dementia back in 2015. When he was first diagnosed with that form of dementia, we had never heard about it before. So while we're Googling like crazy to understand what's going to be happening and how we can help him, we kept coming up on brain donation. And so my dad was going to be a body donor. We knew that he would want to do this. So we made arrangements to donate his brain. The problem was that the NIH's structure of brain banks, the neurobiobank, was only a year old. So it was still really way too complicated to do it right. And so we made the arrangements, but they almost fell apart the day before. So when we talked about it with people and they were like, can you help me do that? Because I didn't know it was a thing. I was like, let me see if I can help them a little bit because it needs to be a better experience for people to do. So that's why we approached the NIH and said, hey, can we help you with that? And they said, sure. So we started the nonprofit of the Brain Donor Project to make noise about this and to simplify the process. There's a couple benefits though, and my dad's tissue illustrates one of them. One of the benefits to families is that even in the face of a great loss, there is some solace to be had in knowing that maybe you prevented some future family down the road from having to go through this. If something good can come from that, we were all about it. And we all kind of felt that way. I still hear it from families all the time. The other benefit is that, and this slide illustrates it, this is actually what they call an enhanced histology images of my dad's brain. And so what they show is, whoops, I did not mean to do that, my bad. There are certain proteins found in the brain that are the hallmark of Lewy body's dementia. And I'm told the staining on this slide illustrates that. So we get this report that's a summary of neuropathological findings. Any family that donates a brain, if they request it of the brain bank, they'll get a copy of theirs. And what it does is it identifies any diagnoses found in the brain, and it talks about the stage of the disease and the region or regions that were impacted. So once we understand more about the genetic underpinnings of Lewy body's dementia, this will be important information for his family to have. So yeah, that's my dad's histology images. So we started the Brain Donor Project expressly to support the brain banks of the NIH, the Neurobiobank. This next slide sort of illustrates where they are. People kind of panic because they're all spread out, but I can tell you that they can get to all these places and still get the brain back to the brain bank in time. So they are at Mount Sinai in New York, at Harvard University, at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, in Miami, Florida, and at UCLA. There's another one in Pittsburgh, but they just work with the ME's office. I can tell you though that recovery specialists have worked in remote Alaska and gotten the brain back to where it needed to be in time. So they work with partners that do some expedited, obviously special shipping. So don't freak out if you're in the middle of the country, and we're not. At the time, we were in northern Cincinnati. So I don't know if you can see my cursor right about here. And they shipped his brain to LA. So obviously we can get things where they need to be. The Neurobiobank is really a special organization, and I just want you to understand a little bit about it. It is our nation's only federated network of brain banks, and it was developed because researchers were coming to the NIH saying, we got a problem. We are having trouble getting our hands on the tissue. Up until then, brain banks or certain collections were housed at teaching hospitals or certain institutions where people felt proprietary about their collection of whatever kinds of brains. And so it was difficult to get access to the tissue. And the NIH said, okay, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to get into the brain banking business. So they contracted with those brain banks I just showed you around the country to collect and store, prepare for lab use, and distribute the tissue across some very great protocols. So now that is the supplies in the Neurobiobank are open to researchers and academia and industry all around the world. At the moment, there are samples from more than 16,000 brains. And the beauty for scientists is they can go to the Neurobiobank's website. You can too, anybody can. If you go there, the beginning part of it is like, oh, you're here because you want to be a brain donor? That's great. We need you really bad. And then it links to our organization to start the process. But if you're a scientist, and when I talk to scientists about this, they get so excited, they can go in, enter the details of their study and some vetting information, and then look through those 16,000 brains, sort it according to what they need for their study. Name a disorder. There's also age-matched, healthy or control brains in there that are needed for every single study. Scientists can put in their request for the samples that they need, get an answer in a couple, 3 days, and all they pay is shipping anywhere on the planet. So this was all devised to help speed up, expedite the answers that are so badly needed for the brain diseases that are out there. So we decided that our mission was going to be to simplify the process and to raise awareness of the critical need for this precious tissue. So we did that through our website, which you can visit at braindonorproject.org. On the left, you can look all around and find out why brain donation is so important. And then you can actually start the process on the site by completing a pretty brief online form. At the end of that form, you hit submit. It's mainly just contact information and room for a diagnosis. And then you hit submit, and we determine which of the brain banks makes the most sense for that family. It's partly because it's closest to you, but that's not the only factor. And this is why it got complicated with my dad, and it would for a lot of other people. Certain brain banks have certain areas of decline or focus. And so we had to massage it a little bit to make sure that people will get accepted where we send them. So we introduce you, let's say, to that brain bank. Let's assume that we're not in a hurry, okay? Let's assume that we got plenty of time to do this. We go ahead and send the family or the person the registration forms for that brain bank. The family or the person will have let us know in the first form whether they want those registration documents by email or US mail. So we honor those wishes. We send out the forms. Then the person completes and submits the brain bank's forms back to the brain bank. We always ask people then to wait a couple days, check in, make sure they got everything. And then the person becomes a registered future donor of that brain bank. We can do this in an expedited setting. If someone's getting close to death, we can move things along a little faster. Rather than sending the forms, we often just, at that point, send the phone number to the right brain bank, and they'll do their vetting, and eventually there will be another set of forms, but they can move things along a little bit faster if that's necessary. The brain bank does make the ultimate decision on whether or not a candidate is acceptable. But yeah, there's really not that many scenarios under which someone wouldn't be a good candidate. So anyway, that's how it works. And you can do it on behalf of someone else. One of the initial questions is, are you doing this on behalf of yourself or someone else? And then the very next one is something to the effect of, are we in a hurry? Whoops, sorry about that. I did not mean to do that. Anyway, Naomi, if you're there, if I can get out of that, say the word. If not, I'll just keep it going. Anyway, so this is how the forms work. Then you learn what's next. The brain bank kind of takes over the relationship at that point, and they provide a 24/7 phone number for the family to have. And the most important thing they're going to ask of the family is to make sure that someone notifies the brain bank quickly, okay? They would love to hear from the family within the hour of death. Even with all the arrangements in place, we can't mess around. The brain has to be back. They used to say the brain has to be back at the brain bank stored properly well within 24 hours. Now they shoot for 18 because there are some new tools that allow them to learn more about the brain if they're able to work with tissue that is, newly recovered. So, so that's what happens. The brain bank gets notified, and they then work with the funeral home. Okay, so I tell families you make 2 phone calls, one to the brain bank, one to the funeral home. They coordinate so that the body is transported to a local facility. Typically, that's the funeral home where the brain is removed. The brain bank sends their pathologist or recovery specialist there, and they remove the brain again through the back of the head, and then he or she ships it to the brain bank. At that point, the body is then released to the family to proceed with whatever they're doing in terms of viewing, burial, cremation, whatever. So you can see that things have to happen so quickly. It doesn't slow down the funeral or anything like that. So to give you an idea of who's signing up to be a brain donor, this is dated. We just crossed 23,000 total signups. So 23,000 people have at least taken the first steps. Obviously, many of those have already passed because we've been around for 8 years. About when they sign up, about a third of the people are controls. However, our chances, and that means, healthy brains, our chances of developing a brain disorder increase exponentially as we age, and we're all living longer than ever. So A, you can see where this is heading. B, not everybody remains a control. Oftentimes people get diagnosed with something, so can't count on those people being there. Of the people who've signed up, I have on here ages 4 months to 104 years, but I have to change that. You may have seen in the news last week that the world's oldest man who lived in the LA area, his name was Maury Markoff, and he was very, very astute. He was still writing a regular blog until a month or so before he passed. His daughter arranged to donate his brain through the Brain Donor Project. So 110 years is now our outside edge. And the thing that's important about him is he's probably the oldest brain ever recovered from someone who was cognitively healthy. So researchers are going to learn a whole lot more from him. So they came from all 50 states, and there are about 200 categories of neurologic disorders that are represented among the people that have pre-registered through us. We try to get the word out. It's our biggest challenge. I've told people one of the reasons I'm glad that Mr. Markoff's story got out is that people will have heard more about brain donation. And so, what keeps us up at night is the thought that somebody may be asked to donate the brain of someone they love in a setting where it was an unexpected death. And if they haven't heard about brain donation before, it's too much to consider at that time when they haven't even gotten used to the idea that this person may be gone. But if they've heard something about it and they know how important and valuable it is, they might be more inclined. So anyway, I'll tell you what this slide's about. We try really hard to get the word out far and wide. We work with a lot of patient advocacy groups. Sometimes we get fortunate enough to get some good exposure and wide-reaching publications. And this was one of those. In late 2018, we were in National Geographic, and it led to a big onslaught of pre-registrations for which we were thrilled. We were also on Science Friday on NPR about 2 years ago, and the scientists are all about what we're doing. So they were all too happy to pre-register and get the process started. We worked with, we had a resolution presented on the floor of Congress to name May 7th National Brain Donation Awareness Day to help get some exposure. May 7th was my dad's birthday, and I got to pick it, so that's why I picked it. So we've done some things about that to make some noise. And then I just told you about the story of Maury, so I'm excited to see how many people learn about this because of him. So we do have some challenges out there, and I wanted to tell you what they're about, just so you know. First of all, I'm going to talk about PD, even though that isn't on here. What's interesting is that there are some situations now where we have to try to manage the supplies a little bit. If people pre-register and mention to us that they have a dementia, we send back a form to see if they meet the criteria that researchers need the most. And the reason is because of the demographic bubble at play right now with baby boomers, a lot of people are dying with dementia, and we could have brain banks full of nothing but that. So they've had to limit it a little bit. And so they're very interested in certain kinds of dementia, certain kinds of people who have dementia. And so we ask about that. But one of the reason I want to bring up PD is PD kind of supersedes a lot of things. And the reason for that is there's a tiny little area of the brain, not much tissue at all, that researchers are most interested in. It's called the substantia nigra, and it's at the base of the brain. And it's so little that, we could run out of supplies, and that would slow or stop research into Parkinson's disease, which would be a terrible tragedy. And Parkinson's isn't the only disease like that. If we, get thin on supplies, it will have an impact on research. So that's one of the reasons this is so urgent. So PD is important. We're also, you've probably read that in clinical trials and other things, we don't have a good representation of certain populations, people of color, other communities that are not well represented in brain banking. So we're learning some ways to reach out and make sure that all kinds of people are educated about this invitation and how important it is. The second is control brains. As I mentioned, people don't always stay control brains. So we need to get a lot of those people to sign up. And then I've recently learned about a couple of these others. Lack of brains in early disease state. Let's say I have ALS. ALS goes pretty quick. The lifespan from diagnosis is often only a couple of years. If I get diagnosed with ALS, those brains are mostly coming from people who die from ALS. But if I have ALS and I wind up dying in a car accident, like shortly after I'm diagnosed, that brain is even more valuable because scientists want to see what it looks like before it has killed someone. And that's the case for a lot of disease states as well. Obviously, by young, I mean people 20s, 30s, 40s, it's not normal for them to die. And so those people are dying in accidents. And when there's a medical examiner or a police investigation involved, a coroner, time is not on our side. There's a different agenda at play. And so it's tough for us to get those brains. And then obviously rare diseases. They can't have enough brain tissue from people with rare diseases to determine what they're going to create in terms of therapies and drugs and cures or vaccines or how to diagnose it better. Brain donation is needed in all those situations. So that's one of the challenges that we face now. So what I like to tell people is to think about your legacy. We spend a lot of time near the end thinking about who's going to get our stuff and what kind of thing do we want happening in terms of a memorial. And if we have any money left, who's going to get it? But the most valuable gift you may have is your brain. And if you could, I ask you to please think about arranging for brain donation in advance. Talk to your family about it so they can see through your wishes. And yeah, it's important, and I hope it's something that you would consider. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I see some here on the side.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. Let's get right into it. We have a
okay,
couple of questions in the chat, and then I thought of some questions too, as you were presenting that I wanted to follow up on.
great.
So the first question that I see in the chat is, please explain how the donation is sliced into many slices that can be used by many labs and researchers for a long time.
Okay, happy to. So when the brain first comes in, this is kind of clinical, but here's how it works. It is bisected, it's cut in half. Half of it is frozen, flash frozen, and the other half is what they call fixed, means it's preserved in some kind of fixative solution. So that, and different ways of preserving it are important for different kinds of studies. So it's important that they do it two different ways. Sometimes they just need little microscopic pieces. Sometimes they need a bit of a slice. For some diseases, they actually want like chunks and pieces. So it depends. I will tell you that we haven't discovered any shelf life yet. That brains that are either in freezers or in a fixed solution that don't really expire. We find better ways to preserve them, but they can last for a long time unless you run out. And there are certain brain regions that we talked about, and certain disease states that, research is threatened if our supplies run low.
All right. And someone said if you register as a control and then diagnosed with a neurological disease, do you have to re-register?
Good question. No. Your brain bank will try to stay in touch with you. They try to reach out to everybody they've got registered on an annual basis. My mom is registered to one that sends a birthday card because they obviously know her date of birth, and they say in there if anything has changed about your contact situation or your medical situation, please let us know. Doesn't mean you're going to be kicked out, but they'll just make note that you are no longer a control and you are now a person who has X. So you don't have to re-register, but they do like to update that information pretty regularly. I should also mention that as part of the registration, the actual registration with the brain bank, you sign medical records releases, and they don't execute those. They don't really send those around to collect your records until a person dies. So that way the record is complete in case they contracted anything else along the way. And that way they know, like, their first objective is to go in to validate the pre-death, pre-mortem diagnosis. In my dad's situation and with some other neurodegenerative diseases, they can't really do a definitive diagnosis until they can do a post-mortem analysis. So we couldn't find out for sure that he had Lewy bodies until they, assessed his brain. So it's nice that, that you get those answers should you need them.
Yeah, that was the next follow-up question that I was going to ask, in
Yeah,
terms of just sometimes people in general can be very nervous about clinical trials. And
yeah.
so kind of what is kind of your takeaway, for families who are kind of unsure or just like really the importance, especially in the PD community, as to why this can help research, in the future and, kind of that pivotal point of why this is so important for the community and for those who may be turned off, or nervous or apprehensive about doing this.
Yeah, very good question. Thanks for bringing that up. So a couple things. Clinical trials are, in many cases, a bit more of a commitment. You need to show up at a certain place and give biosamples or undergo imaging or whatever. I mean, they're awesome. And anytime you are able to participate, we encourage everybody to consider that. But not everybody can. They may be too sick. They may not live close enough to whatever site. And so this is, in many ways, a little bit not quite that big of a commitment because you don't have to follow up a whole lot. This is one thing that you can do, and I can't tell you how valuable it is. I was with the director of the National Institute of Neurologic Disorder and Stroke a couple weeks ago at a thing, and he's like, people don't understand how valuable this tissue is. It's like the most precious thing to neuroscientists. There's no substitute. There is no substitute for donated human brain tissue. And there's only so much we can learn from creatures that are not human because our brains are not identical. And there are many diseases that don't show up in other
Right.
species. So it's really, really critical. If yeah, the other thing, this made me think of this for clinical trials too. We have started asking people when they pre-register if they are in a clinical trial. There are many clinical trials that don't involve brain donation at the end. However, what a great way to close the loop on
Mhm.
the research. If
Mhm.
people can tell us, yes, I was in one, here's what it was about, here's my contact information for the
Mhm.
people that ran it, and maybe even my subject ID. We can circle back and see that the brain tissue that that person will someday donate and connect it to the data Oh my gosh, that's a gold mine of
Right.
information, all from that person. So, yeah, I just really encourage people to think about it. Do you mind if I go ahead and take this next question, Naomi?
Oh,
You,
yes.
I
I
see
think it
what
was a, I
currently
think it was
ready.
a comment. Mhm.
Oh, with the Virginia Anatomical Donation Program. I'm really glad you told me that, Wesley Green, because now I can address the issue of how to do both. So the anatomical donation program means that you're donating your body and it's for anatomical study. Right now, you can't donate your body for anything else. That's the only thing that they collect them for, is for health, medical, allied health programs, so that people can, anatomical. And that means you're touching and learning about the parts. However, and this is not just my bias, although it'll sound like it, the brain is so much more valuable for neuroscience research. So you can do both. In fact, we did for my dad. So the trick is, first, register to be a brain donor. That's the most important thing. Secondly, you have to try to find an anatomical body donation program in your part of the world that will accept the body once the brain has been removed for neuroscience research elsewhere. Okay, so I tell people the easiest way to do that is to do an online search for brain donation programs in, what part of Virginia are you? Are you Central Virginia?
I think they may put in the comment.
No, that's fine. I'm just saying, wherever you live,
Mhm.
or the nearest city is
Mhm.
anatomical donation programs. Then you gotta find them and you gotta call them up and you gotta ask them, will you do this? Will you accept the body that the brain's been removed? Some do, some don't. I don't know the logic to it, but you're kind of at the mercy of what's happening locally because they don't ship bodies around. They only collect from, many times it's a 50-mile radius of their location. Sometimes it's a little farther. So in my dad's case, we were living in northern Cincinnati, so kind of halfway between Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio. And the the body donation program in Dayton would accept the body of someone whose brain had been removed. And so my dad passed it home. They came and picked him up, took him back to the body donation program. It was at Wright State University. And the brain bank sent the recovery person there. So they removed his brain there and shipped it to LA. And then they kept his body there at the anatomical program for those studies. It was, it was kind of interesting. All of a sudden, we sat up and realized that we didn't have a body to bury or a body to cremate, because it was being used. And I do know that my father would be thrilled to know that all his parts were being used. He would think that was great. So the trick is to set it all up in advance, make sure the brain bank and the body donation people know about each other, have each
Mhm.
other's contact, remind the family to share that news at the end, and then it's doable. Yeah.
And so are there any costs associated, once a person passes away, is the transportation to get the brain and coordinating that, is there a cost associated with that?
Not when donating to one of the brain banks of the NIH.
Okay.
So the NIH reimburses for that one-way transport, the pathologist's fee, and the shipping of the brain. So that's covered. So, the family just pays for the funeral or cremation, just like they would if there was no donation involved. There are some other brain bank organizations out there, but they have different protocols. Many of them don't make the tissue accessible to anybody anywhere, or they'll help you find a pathologist, but then you pay their fee. So, I'm really proud of the way the NIH does it. They know this tissue is super valuable, and so they help families get it done.
Another question that I asked or thought of as you were presenting is, I'm not sure if you may have mentioned it, but is there a criteria that you have to have? There are exceptions where people wouldn't be a candidate to be involved in brain donation?
Yeah, that's another good one. So They're very few, actually. So even though we supply brain tissue to researchers all over the world, we cannot take brains from outside the US. And
Okay.
that's because it's challenging enough to make sure the brains get where they need to be. But when tissue comes in from outside the country, it slows things down quite a bit. And so what they call that post-mortem interval, which is the amount of time that elapses between when someone dies and when their brain is stored properly back at the brain bank. It's just too threatened by the farther away you get. So we can't take brains from outside the country. It was funny, when we first started this, there were many more decline factors. For example, we didn't take brain cancer. We worked to try to find a researcher at NCI, the National Cancer Institute, that was looking on that kind of tumor and match those people up because it's so specialized, the types of cancer that show up in the brain. However, we need the tissue that was surrounding it to see how we can make people healthier by, what radiation or chemo is doing to people in the surrounding tissue that we try to keep healthy. So now we take that. We don't take systemic infectious disease, and that's things like CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, because it's highly, there are questions about how contagious it is. So there's concerns about contaminating the lab. We can't take Hep C. Some of the people that are precluded from donating blood for the same reason. So we can't take, at the beginning of COVID, we didn't remember, there was so much we didn't know, and we didn't know how contagious it was. So we stopped recoveries from people, but now they've figured it out, and they're taking, obviously they need those brains for people who are suffering from long COVID. Only a couple of the brains take stroke, so that's one of the factors. Some brain banks are funnier about dementia than others, so we can maximize what we have. Some brain banks focus on children, sad as heck, I know. But so we try to sometimes send those brains there because that's where more of the experts are. So yeah, but other than that, it's like we'll decline for an extended post-mortem interval if somebody's already been dead for too long, an infectious disease, and those are the biggies outside of
And
the
what
country.
is the post enter, time to be able to
So
donate?
the brain has to be stored properly, well within 24 hours of death.
Okay.
So, and like I said, if it's a little sooner, that's even better.
Mhm.
So, I'm so sad sometimes when people don't call us until it's been a while, like a lot of times that happens in mental health situations where a person has passed, often of their own hand, and they have suffered from mental illness their whole life. And it's the family's like, we want some answers to what was going on. And it's like, it's too late. I hate that part, I hate that part when we're telling people it's too late. And so that's the other thing that keeps me up at night, is trying to get to people in advance, or at least before someone has passed, if you have that luxury, to try to make it happen, because that's everything. And not to get too graphic, but the organ itself starts to lose structure immediately upon death, So it can't be used for research once it gets degraded to a certain point.
Okay.
Okay.
Another question, I'm trying to think, did I have any more? Oh, in terms of coordinating with funerals, how is that? Does that hold up, arrangements? Is it normally pretty quick or?
Yeah, it's because the brain has to be back there so quickly. I
Okay.
mean, most people, they don't usually have funerals for a day or two, so that's
Mhm.
not a big deal. And honestly, most funeral homes are like, they've been asked about this before. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So we're finding very few that are like, you want to do what?
Yeah.
Because they've heard about it. And
Mhm.
so And so, and they're, they're agreeable. They understand that by allowing us to do something at their place, that they're contributing to science, especially they bend over backwards to accommodate a family's wishes at a horrible time, so they're fantastic partners for us. If for whatever reason the funeral home is not willing, then the brain bank will look around to find another option.
Okay.
Usually they can find another place that will.
Okay. Do we have any other questions in the chat for Tish before we kind of close out for the evening? So Tish, do you have any final thoughts or final
No,
takeaways,
just
for
please
our
think
audience
about
today?
this. Just
Mhm.
please think about this and talk to your family and friends. More people need to know about this and consider making plans to do it. Especially, sometimes I feel like a brain perv. You know what I mean? It's just like, but the truth is, if you have PD, your brain tissue is a little more valuable because of who you are. And so if you want to have a hand in contributing to future science so other people don't suffer through this, you can, and it's very much needed and appreciated. So if you would just think about that, I would really appreciate it. And if you have any questions you'd rather ask in private, info@Brain Donor Project, and I'll be happy to jump in and see what I can do to answer further questions. Okay.